want to thank you for attending this wonderful opportunity to spend time with one of our country's best-known political commentators, authors, philanthropists, radio and television hosts, Tavis Smiley. Everyone, let's give Tavis a warm welcome. From the Diversity Committee of the College of Global Public Health and the Office of the Provost for the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Diversity. Also applause for them. I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank Andrea Carrazas, President of the Black and Latino Student Health Caucus, and her members who spearheaded our Black History Month Tavis Smiley book event, and Dr. Beverly Watkins, Interim Chair of our Department of Environmental Public Health Sciences, for her role in making today possible. Many thanks to Bridget McCurtis and Uli Baer from the Provost's office. Thanks, everyone. We have approximately 1 hour with Tavis this afternoon, so I want to make the most of it. I could spend the first 30 minutes introducing him. That's how accomplished he is. I was just telling him he has so many books, we have to get him an honorary PhD tomorrow, maybe 2 or 3. But I will keep his introduction brief so he can have more time to speak and we can have more time for our questions and answers. From his celebrated conversations with world figures to his work to inspire the next generation of leaders, Tavis Smiley, broadcaster, author, publisher, advocate, and philanthropist, has emerged as an outstanding voice for change. Smiley is currently the host of late-night television talk show Tavis Smiley on PBS, as well as the Tavis Smiley Show from Public Radio International. Mr. Smiley has written 21 books. That's what I say, wow. His memoir, What I Know for Sure, My Story of Growing Up in America, became a New York Times bestseller, and the book he edited, Covenant with Black America, became the first nonfiction book by a Black-owned publisher to reach #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. In the New York Times bestseller, The Rich and the Rest of Us, A Poverty Manifesto, Smiley and his co-author, Dr. Cornel West, challenges all Americans to re-examine their assumptions about poverty in America, what it really is, and how to go about eradicating it. Mr. Smiley's book, My Journey with Maya, has been adapted as a stage play by Tony-winning director Kenny Leon. The book chronicles his almost 30-year friendship with the iconic poet Maya Angelou, and his 2014 New York Times bestseller, Death of a King, The Real Story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Final Year, is what he will discuss today. His most recent text, Before You Judge Me, The Triumph and Tragedy of Michael Jackson's Last Days, are both being developed as television event series with Emmy winners J.J. Abrams and Smiley as co-producers in partnership with Warner Brothers. The nonprofit Tavis Smiley Foundation is in the midst of a $3 million 4-year campaign called Ending Poverty, America's Silent Spaces to Alleviate Epidemic Poverty in America. Time magazine has cited Smiley as one of the world's 100 most influential people, and Mr. Smiley has been honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Please join me in welcoming Tavis Smiley.
First of all, thank you for such a kind introduction. That may very well be the second best introduction I've ever heard. And I want to say second best, Dean, because I was in Chicago the other day and the person to introduce me didn't show up and I did it myself. So other than that, it's awfully nice and I appreciate it. I've heard said before that the shorter the introduction, the more important you are. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. Well, maybe not in this instance, but ladies and gentlemen, the Pope. So the shorter, the more important you are, so I have some work to do. To get that thing a little shorter. But thank you for such a generous introduction, and thank you for showing up today for this conversation, which I hope will be a dialogue here in just a few minutes. I think part of what's wrong with our country these days is that we are too often engaged in monologue and not often enough engaged in dialogue. My grandfather used to tell me all the time when I was a kid, he said, son, there's a reason why you have one mouth and 2 ears. And so most of us don't often enough engage in what I call generous listening or charitable listening. And I think the best talk show hosts do that. They find a way to be a charitable and generous listener as opposed to trying to impress folk with what you know. I'm always interested in learning and listening. And so I'm honored today that so many of you are here, and I hope we can, again, have some time for some good Q&A a little bit later in this conversation so that I can learn from you. So thank you for coming, and in advance for sharing your knowledge with me. Let me thank the Dean again for her presence today and for being involved in this. Thank you for this opportunity, and to Beverly, who's now being an usher over there, getting people seated. Hey, Bev. There you go. I want to say thank you to Beverly for haranguing me when I was last in New York on one of my recent trips here, and she caught me and asked me on the spot, will you come and speak to the students at NYU? I said, who does this? Like, just grabs you on a sidewalk and says, will you come to speak to the kids at NYU? I said, yes, okay, I'll go. So I'm here because I made a promise to Beverly. So Beverly, thank you for the invitation that I come today, and I appreciate it. So let me just take 15 minutes or so, if I can, a few minutes, just to say a brief word about this book, Death of a King, that they've asked me to talk about, and why the timing of it is so propitious. And then I'll sit down with the Dean and we can go wherever you want to go in this conversation. So I'm here for two reasons. One, because Beverly insisted that I come back to New York to see you. But the other reason is that tomorrow we're going to start a couple of days of filming here in New York, because it just so happens that next Tuesday, April the 4th, is the 50th anniversary of the most controversial speech that Dr. King ever gave in his life. The most controversial speech King ever gave. And he gave it here in New York City at the Riverside Church, where I was just there a few minutes ago before I came here, getting ready for taping. So he was giving this speech at the Riverside Church 50 years ago. The speech is called Beyond Vietnam. And when you get a chance beyond this gathering today and tonight and over the weekend, take some time, because we will celebrate 50 years since this speech was given on Tuesday, April 4th. So take a moment to read this speech. I know that most of you think, some of you, educated though you are, I know you think King only gave one speech in his whole life, right? And the speech, for that matter, only had one line in it, right? Because that's all you know. That's all you know, that I want my children to one day live in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the... I know that's all you know. I'm not going to ask you to go any further in that speech, let alone the hundreds of other speeches that he gave. I know that's all we know is I have a dream. We know that one line, because that's the one line that they loop over and over and over again on the holiday, on the birthday, on anything about King. They loop that line over and over and over again. And so there's a reason why you don't know the Beyond Vietnam speech, because the speech they don't really want you to know, because it was King's most controversial, it was his most subversive speech. The truths that he told in that speech were so subversive that the American people couldn't handle it. And King ended up paying a heavy, heavy, heavy price for giving this Beyond Vietnam speech, the heaviest price, of course, being that they killed him. Now watch this very quickly. He gives this speech here in New York City, April 4, 1967. They kill him 1 year to the day later, April 4, 1968. April 4, 1967, he gives a speech. They kill him a year later to the day, almost to the very hour, April 4, 1968. So this speech, Beyond Vietnam, given here in New York City, put a target on his back, and that bullet was chasing him for a year until they killed him in Memphis on April 4, 1968. I repeat, almost to the very hour. What did King say that got him in so much hot water? I'm glad you asked. The speech again is called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence. And in that speech, at the height of the Vietnam War, King comes to Washington, comes to New York City, rather. I was just in Washington. This is New York, right? Okay, just a second. King comes to New York City, and in this speech, Beyond Vietnam, calls America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Y'all missed that. Here's a black man in the 60s telling white America, you, America, my country, my homeland, we are the greatest purveyors of violence in the world today. Now, even with a Nobel Peace Prize, you got to be a bold Negro to stand up in the 60s and tell America, you, America, are the greatest purveyor of violence in the whole world. If that wasn't enough, King then went on in that speech to advance this notion of what he called the triple threat facing our democracy. King said there's a triple threat facing our democracy. If we don't get serious about this, we're simply going to lose our country. Listen now, this is King 50 years ago this coming Tuesday, telling America that there's a triple threat facing our democracy. And if we don't get serious about doing something about this triple threat, we're simply going to lose our democracy. What was that triple threat? Racism, poverty, and militarism. Racism, poverty, and militarism. Racism, poverty, and militarism. Sound familiar? Racism, poverty, and militarism. This is King, though, 50 years ago. Had a bunch of friends, and I got a whole bunch of friends all across America. Every black person I know, it seemed 8 years ago, 9 years ago, when Obama was elected, would walk around with these T-shirts on that had Obama and King's face on the T-shirt. Everybody had one. We said my neighborhood, everybody had a T-shirt with King and Obama's face on it. And I know what they were trying to suggest, but I made it clear to my friends that Barack Obama's election, satisfying though it was, certainly in retrospect even more satisfying, was a down payment on Dr. King's dream. It was not the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. It was a good down payment, but it was not the fulfillment. I further wanted my friends to understand that there is a distinct difference between King and Obama. King was a prophet. Obama is a politician. A very good one, but don't ever get it twisted. King was a prophet. Barack Obama was a politician. Only a prophet could stand up 50 years ago and say to America, you're simply going to lose your democracy if you don't get serious about racism, poverty, and militarism, the triple threat facing our very democracy. But that truth, as I said, was so subversive that America couldn't handle it then. Let me advance the story right quick so I can get in this chair with the dean. America couldn't even handle the truth because it was too much. So King gives the speech April 4, 67, in the evening, here at Riverside, uptown. The very next day, every newspaper in the country came after him. Who does this Negro think he is to tell us that we are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world? Who does he think he is? We gave this Negro permission to talk about civil rights. Ain't nobody told you that you could talk about foreign policy. That is not your lane. Sit your black behind down somewhere and shut up. That's not your lane, Martin. If it ain't civil rights, shut up. Martin has stepped into foreign policy because for him, as you've heard him say, you've heard him quote 1,000 times, that he was against violence here and against violence there. Violence anywhere, King would say, is a threat to all of humanity. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth leaves everybody blind and teethless. So Martin was against violence everywhere. But he stood in that hall at the Riverside Church and said, I come to this place tonight. These are his words. I come to this place tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. My conscience leaves me no other choice. This racism and poverty and militarism is going to destroy our democracy. And the next day, for saying that, they went after him. And I say they went after him, how can I put this in context for this younger crowd in here? There was no Fox News back in the day. But can you imagine what Fox News would have done to Martin King? The minute he called America the greatest purveyor of violence at the height of a war, they labeled him anti-American. They called him a communist. They called him everything but a child of God because he dared to tell America that they were a great purveyor of violence on the world stage. Fox News Bill O'Reilly would have gone apoplectic. Sean Hannity would have gone into full cardiac arrest. Because that's such red meat to people who don't understand, don't want to drill down what Martin was really trying to say. But there was no Fox News then. But you know what? The liberal New York Times did the job for Fox News. It is embarrassing 50 years later to the New York Times. It is embarrassing to the Washington Post. It is embarrassing to Time Magazine. It is embarrassing to Newsweek. And it's embarrassing to every publication in this country to look back 50 years ago and see what they said about Dr. King the very next day. The next day they said that King, these are facts now. The very next day, one of the papers said that Dr. King had outlived his usefulness. Do you hear this? I mean, how do you put that in print? That Dr. King, Nobel Peace Prize winner, the youngest to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He had outlived his usefulness. They suggested he was no longer of any service to his own race. It's the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine. These liberal publications came after Dr. King. So first the media turned on him. And then LBJ, the president, turned on him. He and LBJ, as you know, had worked together to pass the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, 64, 65. This is King now in 67, right? So a few years later. But they've been boys working together on voting rights and civil rights. But now Martin has said to LBJ, this is wrong, Mr. President. And we were together on this. We were right about this, but I'm going to have to chin check you on this. You're wrong about this one. And LBJ didn't like that. So the media turned on him right quick. And then the White House disinvited him to the White House. LBJ kept meeting with other black leaders of the time, but Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer invited to the White House. So the media turns on him, then the White House turns on him. Then the American people turned on him. The last poll, I know it's hard for y'all to imagine this. The last poll taken in Dr. King's life found, the Harris poll found, that 3/4, I think that means 75%, 3/4 of the American people thought Dr. King was irrelevant. They thought he was persona non grata. 3/4 of the American people. Watch this. 60%, 60% of his own people, black people, thought that he had outlived his usefulness. So the media turned on him, the White House turned on him, white America turned on him, black America turned on him. He was disinvited to black churches. He couldn't get invited to speak any longer in black churches. He is the preeminent black preacher in the world. He's disinvited to black churches. He has a book he's shopping around. He'd written a number of books, a number of best-selling books, New York Times best-selling books. In this town, they would not give him a book deal for his new book. Went everywhere, door to door. They would not give him a book deal for his new book. His op-eds in newspapers, they would no longer accept his op-eds. He couldn't write op-eds in the paper. His organization that he was working through, the SCLC, to raise money to do his civil rights work, the organization went bankrupt. They couldn't raise any money. They cut Martin's money off. Martin Luther King Jr., the one you know from I Have a Dream, died with an approval rating equal to or slightly less than the one that George W. Bush had when he left the White House. Just trying to contextualize this for you. That's how low his numbers were. George W. Bush level numbers when he died. He fell off the list of the most admired Americans, and Martin Luther King Jr. died broke. He died so broke that his friend, another great New Yorker who I will see tomorrow, Harry Belafonte, had to pay for his funeral. He didn't have money to pay for his own funeral because the whole country practically had turned against Dr. King. And it all started 50 years ago, this Tuesday, here in New York City, with that speech called Beyond Vietnam. And so I've come back to New York to tape my shows for next week. So every night on my PBS show, we call this a shameless plug. And I'm going to plug it. It's a shameless plug, but I'm going to plug it. So starting Monday night on my PBS show, seen at midnight here in New York City, right after Charlie Rose on Channel 13. Repeating every day at 2 p.m. on Channel 13. If you're not home, in TiVo it or DVR, whatever you do. But next Monday night, we will have 5 consecutive nights taped here in New York that look at this speech 50 years later and really ask the question, where are we 50 years later on the issues of racism and poverty and militarism. All-star guest every night, racism, poverty, and militarism 50 years later. Now, I asked who all was in this room today, and I understand there are many of you from different schools and different disciplines and different studies, and so I'm glad there's a good mix in this room, because it matters not what your discipline is, what your area of study is, what your goals are, what your intentions are. There's not a one of us in this room whose life or life's work, whose avocation, whose purpose, whose calling. Notice I did not say job. Your purpose, your calling, your vocation. That's what you're trying to find, not a job. But none of us will live lives, or are living lives, that will be untouched by the reality of these three issues being visited upon our society. Racism, we're all impacted by it. Poverty, we're all impacted by it. Militarism, we are certainly all impacted by it. It behooves every single one of us in this room and beyond to try to understand 50 years later, where are we on King's admonition to get serious about racism and to poverty and to militarism. Very simply, as I take my seat, racism is still, to my mind, the most intractable issue in this country. Even after the election and re-election of a black man in the White House, racism is still the most intractable issue in this country. And all we do, it seems to me, when it comes to race, is to sort of play musical chairs. One day it's the Negroes, the next day it's the Latinos, now it's the Muslims. Every single day, based on race or religion, somebody's humanity is being contested. That's all those names. That's all xenophobia is. That's all that homophobia is. That's all that racism is. That's all that ageism is. Somebody's humanity is being contested. It is the contestation of somebody's humanity. And so we're not gaining the kind of ground we ought to gain on racism. There are many Americans, and the Pew Research poll found that many of us think we lost ground. Imagine that we lost ground on race in the Obama era. How is that possible? But we did. Poverty is now threatening our very democracy. It is threatening our very democracy. Poverty is now a matter of national security. These numbers are not sustainable. 1% of the people cannot continue to own and control half of the wealth. Watch this, watch this. The Forbes magazine, not my data, the top 400 wealthiest Americans, 400 individuals in this country, have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million fellow citizens. 400 folk. There are 200 of us in this room right now. Double the capacity of this room. And you got 400 people who have wealth in this country equivalent to the bottom 150 million fellow citizens. This gap, this growing gap between the haves and the have-nots is not sustainable. And the policies that Mr. Trump is trying to put in place now is going to make that gap even worse. It's not about picking on him. It's not sustainable. That is not a democracy. That is an oligarchy. That is a plutocracy. It is not a democracy, and it's not sustainable. And Martin told us that 50 years ago. So we're losing ground on race. We're losing ground on poverty. I voted for Obama twice, and I got into a lot of trouble for trying to hold him accountable and criticize him, and I thought he deserved it. But the reality is that for all that Obama did do or tried to do, his most loyal constituency, black people, check the data, black people lost ground in every major leading economic category during his tenure. We were so in love with Barack. We were so deferential that it became detrimental. Nobody wanted to say nothing. And when you say something like Tavis, you catch hell. Okay, I'm a big boy, I can handle it. I love him, I voted for him, but I'm gonna hold him accountable too. But if you say something, you catch hell. Nobody wants to say nothing. So black people lost ground in every major economic category. Now Trump is coming in behind that? Are you serious? Racism, poverty, and militarism. Barack Obama dropped more drones and killed more innocent women and children than George Bush did. Those are the facts. I voted for him, you voted for him, but he dropped more drones and he killed more innocent women and children than Bush did. Every Tuesday, he personally selected who was going to be on the kill list. That's what the president does every week. He picks who we're going to kill, who we're going to assassinate this week. I was in a deep conversation the other day with a deep theologian out of Vanderbilt. I'm going to put this on your mind. Don't get a migraine. If you study this thing too long, you get a headache. So think about it later. But this professor at Vanderbilt, theologian, said to me the other day, Tavis, the older I get, the more I'm starting to question whether or not it is even possible to be a Christian, a true Christian, and be president of the United States. That's a question for you to think on later. Can you be a true Christian and be the president true Christian, be president of the United States. Donald Trump has done what? Gutted every program he can gut. And where's all the money going to? Defense budget, you saw it. Dr. King said that budgets are moral documents. They're not just financial documents, not just public policy. Budgets are moral documents. To quote that great philosopher Jigga, Jay-Z, you can say what you say, but you are who you are. And when you put your budget on the table, we get to see who you really are. Budgets are moral documents. So I ask you, 50 years later, where are we on racism? Where are we on poverty? Where are we on militarism? And what does that portend? What does it say about the future of our democracy? I will close on this note. I'm inching closer. Now, here's why this King thing just messed you up so much. Because all you know of Dr. King is what? The monument in Washington. I passed this morning catching the train to come here. Big monument in Washington. Only Negro with a holiday named after him. Postage stamp, streets, named on streets, and his name is on schools and libraries all across the country. Everybody loved Dr. King. You know why? Because it's easy to love a dead martyr. We love him now because he's dead. But he told us the truth about racism and poverty and militarism. We didn't want to hear it. Too subversive, too tough for us to handle. So we ignored him. We abandoned him. We isolated him. And then we assassinated him. And now, he's the man. He's a man now. You see how that works? Sometimes it takes a while for people to catch up to the truth. It takes a while to catch up. But here's the problem. Here's the cautionary tale in all of this, for those of us in this room. The question is, what happens to our society 50 years from now? If we continue like we did 50 years ago to listen to those truth tellers who are trying to get us to pay attention right now. If we keep ignoring the truth tellers on climate change, if we ignore them on global warming, if we ignore them on health care for all, if we ignore them on racism and poverty, if we continue to ignore the truth tellers today, where are we going to be 50 years from now? That's why it's important to look at what King said a half a century ago, try to reassess where we are now, and plot a new path forward. On that note, I'm done. Thank you very much.
And just to kick us off, I'm going to ask one question, then we're going to turn everything else over to the audience from then on. A lot of people in this room, and certainly me and many that I know in this room, have, shall we say, taken to the streets again in response to what has gone on. So 50 years after the Riverside speech, what lessons would you draw from Martin Luther King for exactly where we are today and what we ought to be doing?
Yeah. Not what we did in November, for sure. That's the first lesson. That was not the answer to the prayer, as my grandmother would say. So I think that each of us, and this was the message, I think, of King's life, that every one of us has a calling, as I said earlier, a vocation and a purpose. And King would put it this way, where he here, and I quote Martin so much because you can't do any better than Martin. King said all the time that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? I'm talking specifically now to these young people, these students in here. Because you will be taught the exact opposite at NYU, respectfully, and everywhere else. You get an education so you can make a living, so you can make a bunch of money, so you can get rich and take care of your family, whatever else you want to. Most of us are never taught that what life is ultimately about is living a life in love and service to other people. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for other people, not for yourself? So the reason why you're here at NYU, a great school like this, to get the education, is to learn how to be a critical thinker, learn how to think for yourself. That's the ultimate, I think, of education. You learn how to think critically for yourself. You form your own opinions about the world. And then you step into the world to try to make a meaningful contribution. You step into the world to try to leave the world a little better when you leave it than when you found it. I believe, and I was taught as a child and been taught this my whole life, that our love and service to others is the rent that we pay for the space that we occupy. Our love and service to other people is the rent we pay for the space that we occupy. You are here. I can see you here because you're alive looking at me. You're here, but you have to earn your right to be here. You have to earn your right to be here. Why do I say that? Because you had nothing to do with coming here. I was in a conversation the other day, and somebody kept saying, he's self-made, self-made, self-made. I said, shut up. Ain't nobody self-made. I know what you mean by that. It's just a dumb term. He said, ain't nobody, did you birth yourself? Did you breastfeed yourself? Did you change your own diaper? I mean, what does that mean, self-made? Ain't nobody self-made. We are who we are. Can I keep it real? Can I keep it real? We are who we are because somebody loved us. Every one of us, we are who we are because somebody loved us. Your mama, your daddy, if they weren't around, somebody loved you. And that's why you have become who you are and are becoming. We are who we are because somebody loved us. And if we never figure out that King was right, that the goal here is to try to find a way to use the gifts that we have, to use the skills that we have, to use the talents that we've been blessed to have in love and service to other people. So nothing wrong with being rich. Trust me, I've been rich and poor. Rich is better. Nothing wrong with doing well for yourself. But you do know you can both do good and do well at the same time, right? You can do good and do well at the same time. It can't just be about you and your own little individual project. That's not what life is all about. And so King gave his life in love and service to all the rest of us. And anybody asked you to take a bullet to the head. Nobody's asked you to do that. I'm just asking you to live a life where you're trying to love and serve other people. Very quickly, my definition of a foundation, I've had it for a lot of years. We work with young people all across the country in this foundation. And all we do is one thing. I'm like Kentucky Fried Chicken. We do one thing, we do it right. All we do is leadership development. That's all we do. Our foundation works with young people, and we help develop youth leaders. That's all we do. Ages 13 to 18, we get them young, but that's all we do. We don't do nothing else. We just do youth leadership development. And I teach every one of these kids, and there are thousands. At this point, there are tens of thousands of kids all across the country who know this by heart. They got it on T-shirts. They got it tattooed on things. They know this by heart because we teach this to them every day. It's my definition of leadership, and it's very simple. You can't lead people unless you love people, and you can't save people unless you serve people. That is the best definition of leadership you will ever hear. Trust me, and it's mine. That's right. Read all the books you want to read, go to seminars, take all the classes, wrestle with that. You can't lead people unless you love people, and you can't save people unless you serve people. So the ultimate question about leadership is not how many degrees you have, not where you went to school, not how many titles you have, not what kind of money you make, what kind of car you drive, what kind of neighborhood you live in, who your mom and them are, what kind of hookup you got. I don't care. I'm not impressed. If you want to impress me, I want to know what is the depth of your love for everyday people, and what is the quality of your service to them, because that's how I judge people. What is the depth of your love for everyday people, and what is the quality of your service to them? If you ain't living a life as trying to love and serve other people with the gift and talent you have, while you do good for yourself and do well by others, then what's it all about?
Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience. You can come right up to the mic so we can hear you. If you prefer to just stand up and speak loudly, that's okay too. You had your hand up first, my friend. You can use my mic.
Good afternoon, Tavis and everybody. So my name is Taquan Pugh. I'm a filmmaker and writer and also activist as well. I'm here with the youth group at GOES. I'm one of the youth leaders. So my question is, I recently was doing research about Martin Luther King's last life, specifically when he got to Memphis, you know, the first protest they had, then he had to go back. So I was doing research about the group called the Invaders, who were influenced by the Black Panthers, and I just found their relationship and just the whole situation dealing with Martin in Memphis interesting, because it's something that I feel like, you know, I've been going through, you know, being a young adult. Just like, what do you, first off, did you speak about the situation with the Invaders in your book? And also, what do you think about the dynamics of a young Black radical group that's influenced by the Panthers, like the Invaders, and how they can work with older people in our communities who believe more so with assimilation and, you know, just, and compromise. So like, what do you think about that dynamic?
It's a good question. So the short version of what he's saying, powerful question. Thank you for reading that book, brother. I like brothers do their research. Dr. King, you know he went to Memphis and he got assassinated, right? That was his second trip to Memphis. He had gone to Memphis earlier for a march that went awry and violence broke out. And the papers, the news media, which had already been death on Martin King earlier, as I told you, starting a year prior from his speech here in New York. So when this violence breaks out at this march, they said Dr. King has lost it. He can't even have a nonviolent march anymore. They just tore him a new one because this march erupted in violence. And there was a group called the Black Invaders, a group of young people who we later found out Dr. King found out, were sort of, used to try to start some mess at this march so that Dr. King could in fact be embarrassed. And the most beautiful part of the story is, just to do it very quickly, the most beautiful part of the story is that when Martin discovered this, Dr. King said, I'm going back to Memphis. We're going to do this march again. We're going to get it right. Before I do anything, I want to meet these young brothers who call themselves the Black Invaders. And he put the call out, and a meeting was set up, and Martin spent hours. Here's the answer to your question. It takes dialogue. Martin spent hours talking to these young brothers to understand what their frustrations were, what their fears were, and why they had been used in this way. What it ultimately came down to was they felt that Dr. King and the old heads, now keep in mind, King was dead at 39. But to them, he was OG at 39. It makes me feel really old. But they thought that they weren't being listened to and they weren't being heard, and Dr. King gave them the time that they deserved and warranted to hear their concerns. And as you know, they were preparing to do the second march, and Dr. King had them on board, and everything worked out until they killed Dr. King. But the short answer is, it required King engaging in some dialogue, and that's the same thing we need today. But I said earlier, too much monologue, not enough dialogue in our society, particularly generationally. There's just not enough conversation between the generations. Young people always are talked about. Y'all get talked about, you get talked down to, you get talked around, but ain't nobody talking to you, and they certainly ain't listening to you, And so that's what's wrong. I gave a speech the other day, and I was trying to make the point that if you had asked a room full of young people like yourselves, how old are you now? Okay. If you asked a bunch of young people like yourselves in this room today, name 5 people, not including your family, name 5 public figures who you believe love you enough to die for you. We would all die in this room. We'd be here so long and die of starvation because y'all couldn't name 5 people in the public sphere who you believe love you enough to die for you. If you'd asked that question 50 years ago, when the names they'd be rattling off names. Dr. King, Stokely, H. Wright Brown, Huey P. Newton, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, they'd run the list because they'd seen love in action. Love in action. And that's what young folk aren't seeing today. They're not seeing the love in action. I say all the time, folk would rather see a sermon than hear one. Y'all get that? People would rather see a sermon than hear one. I ain't trying to hear you. Somebody once said, people don't know that you care. People don't care what you know until they first know that you care. And we've just sort of failed that test. We sort of failed that test. Very quickly, speaking of King engaging young people, this is a powerful story. It's kind of funny, actually. Dr. King was in Cleveland, right quick. He was in Cleveland in this last year. Because as they were coming after King, what King was doing was organizing a poor people's campaign. The most beautiful part of King's last year is not the negative stuff I told you earlier. The beautiful part is that he was organizing a campaign for poor people in Washington. And that's why they killed him. They knew he was coming to Washington. He was going to set up a tent city on the National Mall in Washington. Y'all remember Occupy? Y'all remember Occupy New York, right? This is going to be Occupy on steroids because he wasn't coming to Zuccotti Park in New York. He was going to the nation's capital on the National Mall. They were going to set up tent city, and King and others were going to live there, not just come there every day, live there for as long as they needed to embarrass the government until they did something about poverty. Lyndon Johnson had promised a war on poverty, and then he got engaged in this war in Vietnam, so all the resources went to war. We needed promised a war on poverty, and Martin didn't like that. So they were going to set up a tent city and then just embarrass the government. Martin was going to live in a tent on the grounds of the National Mall for as long as he and thousands of others it took for them to get their point across. And so Martin was going around the country organizing this Poor People's Campaign very quickly. He went to Cleveland. Was in Cleveland at a stoplight. I'll tell this very quickly. At a stoplight, these prostitutes were on the corner working. They looked in the car and they saw Dr. King and they started calling a bunch of names. You no good mother hucking. You ain't nothing but a pimp. We don't need you. We down with Stokely. You passe. You know. They just started dogging Dr. King. Can you imagine? A bunch of prostitutes dogging Dr. King. Light turns green. Dr. King's driver pulls away. Andy Young, Dr. King's aide, is in the front seat as well. And Dr. King says, Bernard, turn the car around. Andy says, Doc, we're going to be late for this meeting. We're already late. They're kids. They don't know no better. Don't take that personally. We got to keep going. Dr. King said, Bernard, turn this car around. Andy said, Doc, seriously, what are you going to say? I mean, come on. We're organizing this campaign. Let it go. Just let it go. Dr. King said, I said, turn this car around. They turned the car around, pulled up, and when these prostitutes saw Dr. King get out this car, they were like, oh, Jesus. Dr. King wanted to talk to them prostitutes, black prostitutes, to ask them, why are y'all out here? And why do you have such venom against me? What did I do? What is it about what I'm trying to do that you don't quite understand? Because I'm doing it for you. They started a conversation. Andy says, Doc, we are late. He was actually going to preach a sermon at a church. He stopped on his way to church to talk to some prostitutes on the corner. And he's late. And Dr. King said, okay, I got to go. He said, what y'all doing later today? He said, we working this corner. That's what we doing later today. He said, no, what you doing about 2 o'clock this afternoon? I said, we be out here. He said, I'm staying at the Sheraton Hotel. Come to the Sheraton, and we're going to continue this conversation. Because I love y'all, and I want to understand what I've done and why you're so offended with me. They said, you want us to come to the Sheraton? He said, yeah, come to the Sheraton at 2 o'clock. I'll meet you there. 2 o'clock at the Sheraton. Can you imagine a bunch of prostitutes walking in the front door at the hotel? They go to the counter. They say, are we here for Dr. King? They said, what? They said, we're here for Dr. King. And the clerk was like, no, this is not. They said, no, he told us to come see him at 2 o'clock. Call that Negro. We here. They called his room and said, Dr. King, there are some women down here who said you told them to come meet you at 2 o'clock. He said, I did. Put them in the conference room, get some coffee and some donuts and other things, and I'll be down in about 15 minutes. And Martin King went downstairs, and for 4 hours, he sat and talked to a room full of prostitutes and got every one of them registered to vote in Cleveland, and they went on to elect the first black mayor of Cleveland, Carl Stokes. The point of that story is dialogue. And you can never, ever look down on people. Ever, 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 ever. And King never did that.
Okay, we got another question from the audience here. Who would like to line up with the mic or put your hand up?
Oh, y'all scared. Put your hands up. Put your hands up.
Come on. There you go.
Now watch, in 20 minutes, we were fighting to get out of here. Yes, sir.
This is just like a general question of like kind of an issue that I feel like a lot of black students here are facing, where a lot of these infinity spaces or spaces that are for, the minorities are becoming a lot more active in social justice work and whatnot, but are forgetting kind of the reason why they were created in the first place, which is to make sure you're fostering a space where every single person in the population that your name is for. If you're a black student, you got to make sure that every black person on campus can walk into your meetings and feel accepted and feel welcome. But direction is being like kind of changed where we want to make an impact and we want to kind of make a splash, and you're forgetting about the people though.
Sure.
You're forgetting about making sure that people can walk into the room and converse with similar faces.
Right.
How do you find that balance? What advice would you give as far as like which one is more important and how do you kind of combat that?
That's a great question. The most important thing, if you're going to fight, is to be focused on who the enemy is. and be clear about what your agenda and what your agenda is and what your goals are. And that's why that definition that I offered you, and here's the simple answer. That's why that definition I offered you of leadership. You can't lead folk unless you what? Can't save folk unless you. I love y'all. Y'all paying attention. That's beautiful. That's why that definition is so important. Because that's how you judge who the real leaders are. Hold on to that definition, and I promise you it will work for you for the rest of your life. I don't care what leader you're grading, the dean of the department, president of the university, president of the United States, pastor of your church, head of your community-based organization, talk show host, active, so-called community activist. Y'all ain't stupid. You can see. Put them to that test. They're not what I call servant leaders if they're not living up to that definition. Everything on the agenda for the Black Student Union, Hispanic Student Union, whatever organization you're talking about on campus, if you cannot clearly see that the work that they are engaged in is about loving people and serving people, then it's a bootleg organization. But you got a bootleg leader of the organization. If it's not about loving and serving people. Let me explain that a little bit more deeply, because those are words. Let me define what I mean by love and what I mean by serving. This is important, since you're going to hold on to that definition. Try it again. You can't lead if you don't. You can't save if you don't. Let's unpack those terms right quick. By love, I simply mean this, because love is such an interesting word. When you shut down the whole conversation, you put the word love out there. Now, what's ironic about that is back in the day, our leaders, the show enough leaders, were unafraid to put love at the center of their work. They put love at the center of the public square. You know that's what Gandhi did, right? Gandhi put love in the center of the public square. Cesar Chavez put love in the center of the public square. Dr. King put love in the center of the, Bobby Kennedy put love. The best of our leaders, think about it, Nelson Mandela, in your lifetime, the best of our leaders put love of people, love of all humanity at the center of their work. And by love, we simply mean this. Best definition you'll ever hear. Simple, too. Love just means that everybody is worthy just because. That's love. It's that simple. Love means that everybody is worthy, everybody is equally worthy just because. Everybody's somebody's child, everybody's somebody's kid, and everybody is worthy equally just because. Not because of those factors I listed earlier. You're not worthy because your mom and daddy are rich. You're not worthy because you go to NYU. You're not worthy because you live in New York City. You're not worthy because you're white or whatever other color you might be. You're not worthy because you're a male as opposed to a female. You're not worthy because of your religion or your faith. You're not worthy. None of those factors matter. Every one of us is equally worthy just because. No other reason. Just because. Can you imagine how different the world would be if everybody believed that every other person had the same precious value that their life had? You realize after all these centuries of fighting, if every Israeli thought that the life of every Palestinian had the same value, and every Palestinian thought the same way about every Jew, that mess would have stopped a long time ago. The movie Hotel Rwanda would never have been made if every Hutu thought the same of every Tutsi. Would never have happened. We would never have had the civil rights movement if every white person had thought the same, and every black person had the same value that they had. I told you earlier, somebody's humanity is being contested. There would not be sexism or patriarchy in our society if every man thought that every woman was equally valuable. This is a very simple thing. It's hard to do, obviously for some people, but that's what love is. Love just means that everybody is worthy, equally worthy, just because. Now, why does that matter? It matters because whatever work you go into, whatever your calling, your vocation is, every patient is equally worthy just because. Every student in the classroom, I don't care what their background is, every student is equally worthy just because. Every customer that you will ever have, every client that you will ever have, every parishioner, whatever work you go into, if you believe that everybody is equally worthy just because, That you are no better than they are no better than you. We are all worthy just because it fundamentally changes how you see the world and how you go about your work and your witness, whatever it is. But we don't believe that. We got all these complexes. But when you accept that every other person has the same value that you have, it changes again how you see the world and how you engage the world. So that's what love means, that everybody is worthy just because. On service, I'll go back to Dr. King again. King said, watch this, young people. King said that anybody can be great because anybody can serve. All it takes is a heart full of grace and a soul that's generated by love. Anybody can be great because anybody can serve. That sounds counterintuitive, don't it? We don't think of greatness in terms of serving people. This is how we see it. But take a moment, flash back into history, and think of all those persons in this country and around the globe who we are still talking about all these years later. And I bet you'll discover that the majority of those persons we're still talking about all these years later because they found a way with their gift and their talent to love and serve the rest of us. They used their gifts to love and serve us. And so anybody can be great if you start out with an idea that you're going to use whatever gift you have to serve other people. The people will elevate you. You don't have to elevate yourself. The people will elevate you. The people will lift you up. The people will get you back. The people will always be there for you. I once asked Muhammad Ali, we have dinner one night, and I said, Champ, I said, why do you think it is that you are so beloved? Why are you so beloved? He said, Tavis, I'm not sure I'm that beloved. I said, no, come on, serious, Champ. Set your modesty aside for a second. Seriously, why do you think you are so beloved around the world, Champ? It's not because you were the greatest of all time. It's not just because you wouldn't fight in the Vietnam War, because a whole lot of people thought that was a bad idea. Didn't like you for that, called you anti-American. Why do you think you're so beloved? He said, I don't know why, Tavis, but if there is a reason, I would like to think it is because I have never, ever lied to the American people. Whatever they thought of my positions, I never once lied to the American people. He said, I want you to remember this, T. I said, what, Champ? He said, the American people will forgive anything except hypocrisy. They can't handle hypocrisy. So I'm saying, don't be a hypocrite. Be your authentic self. Use the gift and talent you have to do good for yourself, but to love and serve other people in whatever that capacity might be. Oh, you allergic to love?
Yes,
Ooh.
the word. I hate that word. I would like to substitute respect.
Well, I'm curious why you allergic to it. Tell me why. I'm just curious.
Because it is such a fickle, ephemeral phenomenon. It can turn on a dime. It's just fleeting, and respect is a solid concept. And I just wondered if it's a legitimate substitute.
If love is genuine, is it legitimate? If it's genuine love?
Literature and history and everything, it's a very unstable concept. And
I think love is rooted in respect.
well, I'm asking you, do you think, would it be permissible in your worldview to substitute respect instead of that other word, which I really
I wouldn't argue that, but for me, it's all about love. So I'll leave it there. It reminds me of a debate. It's funny. It reminds me of a debate I had with Maya Angelou. You mentioned my Maya Angelou book. For 28 years, Maya Angelou met me when I was just a kid. And for whatever reason, I am fortunate, I am blessed that she just took me under her arm as a kid. And my very first trip out of the country, Maya Angelou took me to Africa. I'd never left the country. I mean, imagine you're a black man. Your very first trip out of the country is going to the motherland. You're going to Africa, and you're going with Maya Angelou. It's pretty cool. My very first trip. And that trip started a 28-year friendship. And for 28 years, Maya and I had a sort of tete-a-tete like this. But it wasn't about love and respect. For 28 years, we argued about which was the greater virtue, love or courage. For 28 years, we had a fight about which was the greater virtue, love or courage. My answer was love, which won't surprise you given my talk today. Maya's answer was courage. And for 28 years, whenever we would see each other the very next time, it could be 3 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 weeks, we would pick that fight right back up where we left it, about love versus courage. And so her thing was courage, and my answer was love. And essentially, her argument was that courage was more important as a value than love, because her thesis was that it takes courage to love. That's what her argument really boiled down to. In my argument, I won't waste your time with. But we went back and forth for 28 years. So I've never had the love and respect fight, but I had that love and courage fight with Maya for 28 years.
Winnie and Mandela, Nelson, right? What happened there?
That's romantic love.
Exactly.
That's a different
Different kind of
situation. That you can fall in and out of.
Is this on?
Last question. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I want to apologize because there's a chance you might have talked about this and I came in a little late.
Not a problem.
So sorry.
No apologies necessary.
But I heard you talk about being able to identify the enemy. And in the nature of what is now feels like very, well, not even tense, but just a lot of intersectionality politics, I feel like there are a lot of lines being drawn about who is the enemy, what that enemy looks like, whether it's in communities or intra-communities. And you're also talking about these aspects of love. So from your perspective, how do you take this notion of love and apply it to spaces where it feels like you're being attacked, where you feel like it really is about you facing the enemy? And how do you apply these principles of love in those spaces?
Powerful question. The simple answer is that I believe, as King believed, that we have to find a way to love our enemies. Or as Martin would say, you got to love the hell out of them. Love the hell out of them, literally and figuratively. Let's find a way to love our enemies, because trying to destroy them is never, that's not the answer. And I don't believe that vengeance, it's my own belief, I don't believe that vengeance belongs to us. I am not in the vengeance business. I am in the truth-telling business. I believe that what our lives ought to be in service to is what I call seeking the truth, speaking the truth, standing on the truth, and staying with the truth. That's my life's work. To seek the truth, speak the truth, stand on the truth, and try to stay with the truth. Now, not that I have a monopoly on truth, because there is the truth and there is the way to the truth. And so I got to be wise enough to know that I don't have all the truths. But I do believe that some of us have to have the courage to speak those truths that we know. We have to have the courage to say what it is we see. And so in these fights, I don't think the effort of the mission is ever to destroy the enemy. It is to enlighten the enemy, to inspire them, to encourage them, to do all those things that will get them to see the error of their ways. Dr. King, back to your question about love, said this all the time. Forgive me. Dr. King said, that love is the only force in the world capable of turning an enemy into a friend. The only force powerful enough to do that, turn enemies into friends. And so I hear your point loud and clear. I think we have to be careful about drawing lines of who the enemy is. But I think at the same time that, we ain't stuck on stupid. And we know there are people whose whole mission, end, and aim is to destroy us. That is their mission, their end and aim, to destroy us. And they will sacrifice nothing to accomplish that. Back to my comments about Trump's budget, Dr. King said that the budgets are moral documents. You can say what you say, but you are who you are. It's hard. It's not just Trump. It's true for any politician, but especially him in this moment. He's the president. It's hard to look at the budget he put on the table and to not see very clearly what matters to him and who matters to him. It's your budget. So the poor don't matter, women don't matter, children don't matter, veterans don't matter, This is your budget, brother. So in that instance, one can draw a line, and one has to stand up and fight against those kinds of cuts that are going to hurt the least among us. So again, I don't believe in destroying people for the sake of them, for the sake of destroying people. I don't believe in declaring someone an enemy and trying to take them out. But I do believe that in this life, we wrestle against all kinds of powers and principalities and evils and darknesses and agendas. And if we can't identify what that is, then we're not focused. I said to brother here, we're not focused on the fights that we have to be engaged in. Okay.
You have been absolutely splendid. We're going to, in a moment, thank you. And then there is a group that has a special session with you. They know who they are. And the rest of us will file out through the book room. And all I can say is this is beyond description. And I'm sure everyone in the room feels the same way I do.